I think you might have to know a little bit about Pokemon to understand why this answer is not an example of evolution. Because don't the individuals evolve in Pokemon? And we know in reality that an individual cannot evolve, right? Only species can evolve. So how do scientists know when evolutionary change happens? So we are on slide 118. This is part 6. So this is the last part of our evolution notes. Well, to clarify how evolutionary change operates, scientists often find it helpful to determine what happens when no change takes place. So biologists will ask, are there any conditions under which evolution will not occur? Interesting. In order to know if something is, you have to know when it's not, right? Like, if someone just walked in the classroom, the only way to know that they weren't here, that they're new is that they weren't here before, right? So the negatives have to be there with the positives. So to answer the question, scientists use the HardyWeinberg Principle. HardyWeinberg. Now, it's a good thing we don't have to know. We don't have to memorize it. Yay! No math in this class, okay? But you still have to know what it's for. And it's to predict if a population is evolving. So if you have a question on a test, what mathematical principle is used to predict if a population is evolving, and there's 4 choices, you have to know that it's the HardyWeinberg Principle, okay? It gives biologists a standard from which to measure changes in allele frequency in a population. So you would put in these different pieces of information and you would solve for the formula. It's actually not too challenging, but we don't have to know it. We don't have to know the formula, just what it's used for. Predict if the population is evolving by measuring changes in allele frequency in the population. So if a population satisfies these 5 main conditions in the HardyWeinberg equilibrium, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we're going to go over here, okay? It is said to be what's called an equilibrium, and there's no evolution happening, okay? So there's a trick to this, so pay attention. So no choosing, no selection. It's just random mating. So you can imagine, nowadays, imagine anybody in the hallway going out with anybody else based on nothing other than the fact that they were the opposite sex. It's never going to happen, is it? Or, in a bar or in a whatever. Tinder wouldn't do anything, right? None of those dating websites, you wouldn't swipe. You just choose the first one every single time. That doesn't happen. Remember that, okay? All right. No mutation. Wait, where'd we go? Oh, large. We jumped down to number 4. Large population, okay? So that's not always the case in reality. Sometimes it's a small population. No migration. So here. Oh, I think I started with random mating. Started with this one down here, not this one. Actually, that's both of them. Yeah, this is random mating and no selection, no choosing. I don't know. Okay. No, that's down here. Sorry, no natural selection. That's this one. Okay. Keeping track of all 5 of them. Now, where were we? No migration in or out of the population. So this one, okay? See how these are different species? No, so that doesn't always happen either. That's very rare for there to be isolation. There's always migration in and out of populations. No mutations that can occur. That doesn't happen either. Mutations always happen. This is a extreme example, but three-eyed frog, but that doesn't happen either. So the point is that none of these things ever happen. All of these things are supposed to happen. That's why we know evolution is occurring, because in order for it to not occur, all 5 of these things here would have to happen, and it never happens. Does that make sense? We know it's happening because these things never happen. Okay. All right, so we have to test yourself. It's in your notes. You're going to do this on your own. And now we're on slide 123. What types of selection are there? So there's something called stabilizing selection. And this is a type of selection, natural selection, that favors the intermediate group, the phenotypes. The middle has the better fitness. So here you've got a lower fitness and the highest fitness, but for some reason the middle fitness is selected. Robins typically lay 4 eggs. Okay? An example of stabilizing selection, larger clutches may result in malnourished chicks. So better fit, larger clutch, more eggs. You think, oh, they're laying more eggs, they're gonna, be at a higher survival rate. Not always, because the parents might not be able to feed all the babies, so the babies would be malnourished. Malnourished means bad nourishment, right? They don't get enough nutrients, so they get weak and die. You see? That would be this side, the greater, larger fitness. Smaller clutches, let's say that some of the robins have 3 eggs rather than 4. And that might result in no viable offspring. So, because the parent's not making the right number of eggs, and so they have, the babies might be sick, or something's wrong. There's not enough to survive. They might get eaten by predators or something like that. So there's not enough to survive. 4 is the perfect number. The middle fitness is best. That's stabilizing selection. Okay. Directional selection. So it acts against individuals at one of the phenotypic extremes. So this is the peppered moth observation that was made in the industrial era, industrial revolution, industrial melanism, remember all that, the moths up on the board there, okay? So a certain thing will happen in the environment that selects against one and favors the other. That's directional selection. Individuals at one end of the graph, how'd that go away, have higher fitness than in the middle. So the light-colored pepper moths are better camouflaged against the pristine, clean environment. And the dark ones are better camouflaged against the sooty environment. So we remember that whole scenario. Disruptive selection. So here now, the 2 extremes are being chosen, and against the average. So this favors individuals at both extremes of the phenotypic range. Individuals in the upper and lower ends have fitness higher fitness than individuals near the middle. So these are buntings, they're birds. Both the dull and the brightly colored have the most chicks, but the ones in the middle don't have the most. And this results in speciation. Remember that word where you start with one type of individual and then based upon something in the environment, they branch off into different species. And these birds live in North America. Male lazuli buntings. I don't think I've ever seen one. They might be in Canada or something, I don't know. Maybe even in Mexico, I'm not sure, like upper Mexico. And then the fourth one, sexual selection. So this is a special case of natural selection. It acts on an organism's ability to obtain a mate. Leads to the evolution of secondary sexual characteristics. And of course, these give advantage in mating. So all the colors and the dancing courtship displays, the difference between male and female mandrills. A mandrill's kind of like a baboon. Fiddler crabs, the males have the great big fiddler claw that virtually does nothing. They can't use it at all except for attracting a mate or maybe, defending a territory, but they can't. You could put your finger in there and it doesn't hurt. It doesn't do anything. It's weak. It's just there for show. It's quite amazing. Same with the peacock's feathers. It actually is other than attracting a mate, it doesn't serve any other purpose. And this is what sexual dimorphism is. Remember, di means two, morph means shape or pattern or form. So there's two forms based upon your sex. Ducks oftentimes show this as well. You can tell the sex of a male and a female just by looking at them and their colors. See this? Look at the male and the female. That's the female and that's the male. Now his feathers are fluffed out, kind of like a peacock of the bird of paradise, and there's all different kinds of birds of paradise. So this is what sexual selection is, a special case of natural selection. Another test yourself for later. It's all about different kinds of selection. Okay, and now we're going to talk about macroevolution. Last time we talked about microevolution. This time we're going to talk about macroevolution. Micro, macro. Okay? It's evolution on a grandiose scale. What you see when you look at an overarching history of life, like the origin of mammals or the origin of flowering plants. Because before flowering plants, there were no flowering plants, but many of those kinds of plants still exist today, like ferns and palms and gymnosperms, which are conifers, which are pine trees. There's no flowers, right? So those types of trees existed before flowers did. And we're talking pre-dinosaur time. 3.8 billion years of evolution is of these things happening equals macroevolution, the grand scale. So how does isolation lead to speciation? This is one of my favorite parts because I love the fact that we can see this happening with Darwin's finches and many other different types of organisms. We can see speciation has occurred because they're so closely related, but their beaks are different, or their shells and the tortoises are different, or things like that, okay? So one of the most important factors involved in speciation or evolution of a new species, that's the definition of speciation, evolution of a new species from one individual, is isolation. So something isolated it from the other population, which now allowed them to adapt and evolve, okay? Anything preventing two groups within a species from interbreeding, thus creating two new populations. Perfect example would be if some apocalyptic event cut off all technology from people around the world. All technology, all electricity, all technology, no longer available. We couldn't make a spark. We had to go back to caveman times, okay? Which really wouldn't be caveman times, it would be more like medieval times, all right? And if that was the way it stayed for 100,000 years, we might start seeing speciation in humans. Humans might start to speciate on the planet like they did millions of years ago with Neanderthals and those, other things. But then, of course, we learned how to build boats and go across the water and migrate with our seasons and things like that. So we mixed populations. But anyway, long story short, this is the Panama Canal, okay? Isthmus of Panama, about 3.5 million years ago, which separated the Caribbean Sea from the Pacific Ocean and made these two pork fish speciate into different species. And it happens in clownfish. The first one is geographic isolation, and this is the easiest one to understand. So it's called allopatric. It occurs when a population is divided by a barrier, like a mountain range, a desert, a river, or a landslide, and two populations can't interbreed anymore, so they're separate from each other, and that's what the Grand Canyon did to these squirrels and chipmunks. A river, well, a flow of water from an emptying lake carved out, in kind of a backwards fashion, carved out the Grand Canyon in a relatively quick time. It didn't take millions of years. It took, maybe a few thousand years for this to happen. And it carved through, and it's still carving, but it's much lower, much less flow now, the Colorado River. So 10,000 years ago, these two species, the kaibab squirrel and the Abert's squirrel, were originally one species, and then they were unable to cross this chasm. They can't get across the river. They would go in the river and die. So they became two different species. Same with the Harris chipmunk and the white-tailed chipmunk. They live on the south rim and the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I've been to the south rim twice in my life. You should go. No pictures or movies do it justice. You have to go there. Behavioral isolation. Okay, so this occurs when two populations are capable of interbreeding, but they have differences in mating or courtship rituals or other behaviors. Okay, so here's the boobies again. These are blue-footed boobies. They select mates only after a unique courtship ritual. If the mate is unable to or does it poorly, it will not be chosen for. And then this is a meadowlark, beautiful singing bird, and their population is diminishing because people are taking former land and just building housing communities and roads, which takes away their habitat, which is meadows. That's why they're called meadowlarks. We have them here in Florida, the eastern meadowlark. But anyway, you can see they have overlapping regions, but with different mating songs. So this one has a different mating song than that one, so just the song will not attract the other one. Even though they could, they won't. And then different fireflies, even though they have similar species, they have different flashing tones in their lights, and they won't be attracted to the ones that aren't matching them. Temporal isolation. Temporal means time. So two species that reproduce during different seasons or different times of day. So American toads in the early summer, whereas Fowler's toads in the late summer. So the difference in their season means they don't interbreed. Even though they're close enough to and could, the temporal isolation stops them from. Same with the eastern spotted skunk and the western spotted skunk. Late summer, that should not say late summer also. Typo, I think, okay? Or is this one different times of day? Yes, they still mate in late summer, but different times of day. That's what that one is. I don't know why that's not there, but. Okay, reproductive isolation. So eventually the gene pool becomes so different that the two populations can no longer interbreed, even if they were brought together. So, for example, let's say that the river somehow dried up. And now these two populations have been separated for so long by this river, and then they are able to come back together again, but if they tried to, they're too separated and the eggs will not be capable of being fertilized by the sperm. They're just too far separated now. Okay, this is how does environmental change affect speciation? Where are we now? Let's see. We only have 5 slides left. Woohoo! Okay, not too bad. All right. So the biodiversity of life on Earth has developed from natural selection over vast periods of geologic history. The amount of change is linked to the degree to change in the environment. Okay, I don't like that sentence. The amount of change is linked to the degree, that should say of, please fix it in your notes, to the degree of change in the environment. So the more the environment changes, the amount of change increases, okay? Rapid environmental changes, this is building on that, cause rapid changes in the species. The more stable the environment, the slower the rate of evolution. And it may take millions of years for a species to change enough to be categorized as a new species. Think about, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Life started about 3.8 to 4 billion years ago with bacteria, and then multicellular organisms and, sponges and up and up and up, right? To more complex organisms. That was millions of years. People think the dinosaurs were around when people were around. It was 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs were here. And mammals have had all that opportunity to develop and grow. An unstable environment is often the driving force for evolution. This is kind of the same thing being said in different ways. That's like the third time we've said that in the past 2 slides. Variation in a species increases chance of survival. We know this of at least some members of the species. So we know that the more variation there is in a species, the more chance there's survival. The more variation, the more, in people, the more people will be immune to viruses like COVID. A stable environment results in a stable gene pool, and again, little change in the population. That's just a rephrasing of the one from the last slide. A failure to adapt to a changing environment may result in the disappearance of a species, and that is called extinction. I mean, you can just imagine what the planet looked like a month, 2 months, 6 months. 6 months. All the stuff had fallen down after the impact of the comet or asteroid 65 million years ago that hit the Yucatan Peninsula in eastern Mexico, western Gulf of Mexico, just that way, not too far from Florida, okay? What the landscape looked like could have been something very similar to this, 6 months after the impact. So they were unable to adapt to that extreme changing environment, and almost everything went extinct. Only the animals that could hide well, think about alligators. Alligators are still alive today because they were alive back then. Why? They were scavengers. They can hide under the water, hold their breath for a long time. They were able to survive. Hibernate. The fossil record shows that millions of species lived for a while, failed to successfully adapt to the environment, and have gone extinct. Virtually every fossil we find is no longer a species. They died, their species died off, evolved into something else that is, the remnants today, like birds and lizards and snakes and things like that. So the majority of organisms that have lived on Earth have gone extinct. Like 99% of the organisms that ever lived on the planet are now extinct. That's just amazing. There was a great Permian extinction 252 million years ago, 250 million years ago. 96% of the species died off. For some reason, something happened in the environment that did that. The KT extinction, that was the one we were just talking about, where the meteor or comet hit, killed off the dinosaurs and made way for the mammals. There were 5 great mass extinction events, killing at least half of the species on the planet. It's just amazing. So at one time, here's an example. At one time, so pay attention because there's questions. The ancestors of a population A and B, I think this is in your notes, were part of the same population. At one time, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, okay? This mountain range did not exist. And the populations could freely move about, interact, mate, and have babies, okay? Over many years, maybe it was a convergent boundary, plate boundaries were coming together and it made this mountain range grow, separating the two populations, right? And the climate on the west side, over here, of the island changed because of the mountain range. But the climate on the east side remained the same. So here are some questions. What barrier separates two populations? Well, that's pretty obvious. But don't just say mountains. We talked about barriers in our notes. What do we call this? Starts with a G. Write the right word. That's wrong. It's supposed to be geographic or separation. Write geographic separation, okay? All right. Oh, that would be isolation. Okay, that's the next question. Geographic. Okay. I don't like that question. Okay, so what type of isolation? Geographic isolation. It just seemed too obvious. Which population, A or B, is most likely to change more? The one that has the environmental change. Side A, the west side. Which population will most likely evolve into a new species more quickly? Same, A. If populations A and B are reintroduced, maybe over the years, a pathway opens up, or the mountains erode, or something like that, or some land rises over here, allowing whatever, okay, like the sea level drops, or something like that. What kind of isolation? So they will not be able to reproduce because now they're different species. What kind of isolation is this? And that would be reproductive isolation. So this is a type of question that you might see on an upcoming test or on your EOC. They will have a diagram like this with some questions like that go along with the diagram, and you would have to determine those answers, okay? What do scientists think is the time frame for evolution? And this one should look familiar. The whale evolution. Much debate exists about the time frame. There are two hypotheses. The first one is gradualism. So evolutionary changes are slow, gradual, and continuous. And we can see this in the layers of rock. Rock strata, okay, that means layers. So, did I go backwards? I did, okay. We can see the gradual change over time with the different fossils over time. And then speciation, and the whales are a perfect example of that, okay? The second one is called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated, like punctuation in a sentence. Punctuation, like at different intervals. And equilibrium means it's kind of always has been that way. It's equal. Stability. Species have long periods of stability and then bam, something happens to change. Interrupted by short periods of change. And then a long period of stability and then bam, something happens to change. So this is quick jumps, like less than 100,000 years. This is the second thought of answering this question. What do scientists think is the time frame for evolution? So it's either punctuated equilibrium or gradualism. All right, and that ends our notes for this whole unit. But we do have lots of activities and review activities to do before our assessment on this.